The Last Run. A vanishing on Highway 17. The rain fell in relentless sheets on that October night in 1990, transforming the asphalt of Highway 17 into a slick, reflective ribbon cutting through the dense forests of northern Michigan. Somewhere along that stretch, between the flickering glow of a roadside diner and the looming shadows of the Huron National Forest, a man, his name etched into a faded CB radio handle as Long Haul Larry, simply ceased to exist. His rig, a weathered Kenworth with a rust-streaked hood, was found abandoned at a desolate rest stop near Mio, its engine still humming, the driver's seat warm, as if he had stepped out for a cigarette and dissolved into the mist. But Larry never smoked, and he never walked away from his truck, not without a word, not without his logbook, and certainly not without the one thing he carried everywhere. A worn leather diary, its pages filled with meticulous notes, coordinates and fragments of thoughts no one else had ever read. His final transmission had been routine, almost cheerful, a crackling voice over the radio at 10:47 p.m., confirming a delivery schedule with the dispatcher in Toledo. Copy that, over and out. Then silence. No distress call, no skid marks on the pavement, no signs of struggle inside the cab, just his thermos, half full of cold coffee, a crumpled map of the Upper Peninsula, and the eerie absence of a man who had spent 20 years navigating these roads, like the back of his calloused hand. The police would later say the scene was too clean, as if the night itself had swallowed him whole. Back in Bay City, Larry's wife, Margaret, sensed something was wrong before the state troopers knocked on her door. She'd lain awake for 2 nights, staring at the rotary phone, willing it to ring with his familiar "Hey Mags, just pulled into Marquette." But the only call that came was the one that shattered her world. Their 2 sons, then teenagers, watched as their mother's hands trembled around a cup of tea that went cold, her voice a whisper. He wouldn't just leave us. And she was right. Larry wasn't the type to vanish. He was a creature of habit, a man who called home at the same time every evening, who sent postcards from every truck stop, who had a standing order for cherry pie at the diner in Grayling. His disappearance wasn't an absence. It was an erasure. For years the case lingered in the cold files of the Michigan State Police, a ghost story told in hushed tones at truck stops from Detroit to Duluth. Theories swirled like the snow in those northern woods. Had he stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen? Was it a hijacking gone wrong? His body buried in one of the endless acres of pine? Or had the road itself, that lonely, winding ribbon, claimed him, as it had claimed so many before? But without the diary, the one piece of him that might have held answers, the truth remained locked in the past, as elusive as the man himself. And then, 33 years later, the diary surfaced, not in a police evidence locker or a dusty attic, but in the hands of a retired logger who'd found it wedged beneath the floorboards of an abandoned cabin deep in the forest. Its pages were yellowed, its spine cracked with age, but the final entries, they didn't just tell the story of a missing man. They revealed a secret Larry had carried to his grave, or wherever the night of October 12th, 1990, had taken him. Now the question isn't just what happened to Long Haul Larry. It's what was he hiding, and why? After all these years, has the truth decided to come to light? The highway stretched, like a scar, across the empty night, its asphalt veins pulsing with the dim glow of streetlights that flickered in the cold wind, just as they had on that last evening in October 1990. When the world seemed to swallow James Holloway whole. His rig, a rust-streaked Kenworth with a faded blue stripe, was found abandoned at a desolate truck stop near the Nevada-Arizona border, its engine still humming faintly, as if waiting for a ghost to return. The keys dangled in the ignition, a half-drunk cup of coffee sat cold on the dashboard, and his logbook lay open to a page smudged with what might have been rain or something darker. But of James himself? Not a trace. No footprints leading away. No signs of struggle. No whispers from the desert to explain where a man of habit, a father of two, a husband who called home every night without fail, could have simply vanished. The investigation that followed was a tangled web of frustration and half-formed theories, each more unsettling than the last. Authorities combed the area for miles, their flashlights cutting through the sagebrush like knives, but the land kept its secrets. Some believed it was an accident. Perhaps James, exhausted after another grueling haul, had wandered into the desert disoriented, his body claimed by the relentless sun or the hungry coyotes. Yet others pointed to the eerie precision of his disappearance. The truck left running, the personal belongings untouched, as if he'd been plucked from existence mid-thought. Then there were the darker murmurs. Truckers along that route spoke in hushed tones of strange lights seen near the highway that night, of shadowy figures lurking near the rest stops, of a man matching James's description, arguing with someone in the parking lot, though no one could ever agree on what the other person looked like. Detectives chased every lead, but each one dissolved like mist under the desert sun. A waitress at a diner, 50 miles away, swore she'd served James breakfast the morning after he vanished, his hands shaking as he scribbled in a small notebook. But the timeline didn't add up, and her story was dismissed as exhaustion or imagination. His CB radio calls were traced to a dead zone where signals dropped without warning, as if the air itself had conspired to erase him. And then there was the chilling detail his wife revealed in a trembling voice during an interview. James had been acting different in the weeks before he disappeared, quieter, more distracted. Once she'd found him burning something in the backyard, his face pale under the moonlight. When she asked what it was, he'd only said, "Things better left unsaid." Theories spiraled. Was it foul play? A debt unpaid? A secret life no one knew about? The FBI briefly entertained the idea of a serial predator targeting lone drivers, but no other cases matched. Trucking companies whispered about cargo theft gone wrong, but James's trailer was empty, its locks intact, and always, beneath it all, that gnawing question: why would a man with everything to live for walk away without a word? The case files grew thick with speculation, yet thin on answers. Detectives retired. Witnesses forgot. The highway swallowed another winter, then another, its asphalt sealing over the cracks of a mystery that refused to stay buried. But one thing lingered, like the scent of diesel on a cold morning, the sense that James Holloway hadn't just disappeared. He'd been erased, and somewhere, in the folds of time, a truth waited, patient as the desert, for the right moment to surface. Perhaps it was written in the pages of a diary no one had yet found, or perhaps it was still out there, hidden in plain sight, daring someone to look closer. Would you? The years stretched on like an endless highway, each mile marker a cruel reminder of what was lost. The truck driver's family never stopped searching. Not in the fields where his rig was last seen. Not in the faces of strangers who might have known something. Not even in the quiet moments when the weight of his absence pressed down like a physical force. His wife kept his favorite flannel shirt hanging in the closet, still smelling faintly of diesel and the cheap cologne he splashed on before long hauls. His daughter, just a child when he vanished, grew into a woman who flinched at the sound of an idling engine, her mind always pulling her back to that last phone call, the static, the half-finished sentence, the dial tone that had become the soundtrack of her grief. Time did not heal, it only deepened the wound. His grandson, born years after the disappearance, knew him only through faded Polaroids and the stories his grandmother whispered at bedtime, tales of a man who could fix anything with duct tape and a pocket knife, who sang off-key to Johnny Cash on the radio, who always called home. The boy would trace the lines of his grandfather's face in the photos, wondering if he had the same stubborn jaw, the same way of tilting his head when he laughed. The family's pain was not just their own. It had seeped into the next generation, a ghost at every holiday table, an empty chair no one dared to remove. The investigations had long gone cold, but the questions never did. His wife would wake in the dead of night, convinced she heard his boots on the porch, only to find the hallway dark, the house too quiet. His brother, a man of few words, took to driving the old routes himself, as if retracing the miles might somehow rewrite history. And his daughter? She kept a shoebox under her bed, newspaper clippings, police reports, letters from psychics who swore they saw him standing by a rest stop in Nevada. None of it brought answers. None of it brought him back. Yet, they clung to the hope that somewhere something remained. A clue overlooked. A witness who had stayed silent. A truth buried too deep for the world to see. Because the alternative, the idea that he had simply ceased to exist, that the man who had kissed his wife goodbye on a Tuesday morning in 1990 had vanished without a trace, was too vast, too cruel to bear. The family had learned to live with the unknown, but they had never learned to accept it. And so, they waited, not with the desperate urgency of the early years, but with a quiet, gnawing resolve, because in a story with no ending, every day was another page left blank. And then, one autumn evening, as the leaves turned the color of rust, and the air carried the first bite of winter, a call came, a voice on the other end, hesitant, almost disbelieving. We found something. The words hung between them, heavy with possibility, heavy with dread, because after all this time, after all the silence, the past was finally knocking, and it was holding something in its hands. All decades had passed since the night Henry Mercer vanished, without a trace, his truck abandoned at a desolate rest stop, the keys still in the ignition. The case had long gone cold, buried beneath layers of time and fading memories, until the day an old leather-bound diary resurfaced, pulling the past back into the light. It was found not by investigators, not by family, but by a stranger, a young archivist named Daniel Reeves, sifting through the forgotten contents of a rural Pennsylvania estate sale. The diary had been tucked inside a water-damaged cardboard box, its pages yellowed but intact, the name Henry Mercer embossed in fading ink on the cover. The date of the final entry, October 12, 1990, just 3 days before he disappeared. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Mercer family. Henry's daughter, now in her 50s, had spent her life chasing ghosts, clinging to the faint hope that one day anything would surface. When Daniel reached out, his voice trembling over the phone, as he described the diary's condition, the weight of the moment crushed her. This wasn't just a relic, it was a voice from the grave, her father's handwriting, preserved in ink, waiting to tell a story no one had ever heard. But what secrets had he kept? Why had the diary been hidden away for so long? And most chilling of all, what had he written in those final pages? The answers lay between the brittle sheets, each word a clue, each sentence a thread, pulling at the fabric of a mystery that had haunted them for generations. As the family gathered around the kitchen table, the diary resting between them like an unearthed time capsule, the air thickened with a mix of dread and desperate hope. They knew, without reading a single word, that this was no ordinary journal. The way it had resurfaced, the hands it had passed through, the years it had spent in silence, suggested something far darker than a simple disappearance. And as the first page was turned, the truth began to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. What would you do if the past reached out with a voice you thought was lost forever? Would you dare to listen, or would the weight of its secrets be too heavy to bear? The diary's yellowed pages crackled under cautious fingers as they turned, each one whispering secrets long buried beneath the weight of time. He had written with a precision that bordered on obsession, every mile logged, every rest stop noted, every fleeting thought immortalized in ink that had since faded to the color of old blood. The first entries were ordinary enough, the musings of a man who lived his life on the road, where the hum of the engine was his only constant companion. But even in the mundane, there were shadows. June 12, 1990. Another night in the cab. Another stretch of I-80 disappearing under the wheels. The radio's been nothing but static since Nebraska. I swear, sometimes it's like the air out here is too thick for sound. Just me, the truck, and the dark. Funny how you get used to the silence. Funny how it starts to talk back. His words painted a portrait of solitude, but not the peaceful kind. There was an edge to them, a tension coiled beneath the surface. He wrote of the truck stops where he'd linger too long over black coffee, watching the other drivers, men with hollow eyes and stories they never told. Some nights, he'd jot down their names in the margins, as if keeping tally of souls he feared might vanish like smoke. Met a guy named Harlan tonight. Said he'd been driving the same route for 20 years, never took a day off, never wanted to. I asked him why. He just laughed and said, "Some roads don't let you leave." I didn't press. Then came the entries that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A mention of headlights in the distance that never got closer, no matter how far he drove. A note about a CB radio transmission he swore was meant only for him. A voice, distorted and slow, repeating coordinates that led to nowhere. June 18th. Found a diner off Route 66 that wasn't on any map. The waitress called me by name before I even sat down. When I asked how she knew, she just smiled and said, "You've been here before." But I haven't. I'd remember a place like this. The further one read, the more the diary felt, less like a logbook and more like a confession. He was documenting something, yes, but not just the miles, not just the weather. There was a pattern to his fear, a rhythm to the way his hand trembled as he pressed the pen to paper. And then, on the very last page before the entries dissolved into frantic scribbles, a single sentence stood out, underlined so hard the ink bled through the paper. "They're not following me. They're waiting." The question lingers, heavy and unshaken. Waiting for what? And who, exactly, were they? The answer, if it exists, is buried deeper in those pages, where the truth curls around itself like a serpent, ready to strike. But to uncover it, one must first dare to walk the same roads he did, and risk hearing the silence talk back. The pages of the diary grew thinner, the handwriting more jagged, as if each word had been carved under the weight of something unseen. By October of 1990, the entries had shed their mundane rhythm, no longer just logs of mileage or notes on roadside diners. Instead, they pulsed with an urgency that clawed at the edges of reason. He wrote of the others now, the men who shared the long hauls with him, their names scrawled in the margins like warnings. Met Carl again at the truck stop in Des Moines. He laughed too loud when I asked about his last run. Said the roads talk back sometimes. Didn't elaborate. His eyes, like he'd seen something that wouldn't let go. The ink bled into the paper, as if the words themselves were struggling to stay contained. Then came the references to the others, not just fellow drivers, but something else. "They're not all like us," one entry whispered. "Some don't sleep. Not really. Just sit in their cabs, engines humming like a lullaby for the dead." The dates blurred together, the entries fractured by gaps where pages had been torn away, or perhaps never written at all. A single line, underlined so hard the pen tore through the paper. "The CB radio picks up voices that aren't there. Or maybe they are, and we're the ones who aren't." The tension coiled tighter with each word, the trucker's isolation becoming a living thing, pressing in from the dark corners of rest stops and empty highways. Most chilling were the sketches tucked between the pages, crude, frantic drawings of figures standing too still beside the road, their faces blurred as if moving even on the page. One entry, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, read like a confession. "I think they've been following me since Kansas. Not the drivers, the ones who ride with them, the ones who don't get out of the truck." The words trailed off, the sentence left unfinished, as if he'd been interrupted, or worse, as if he'd finally understood something too terrible to write down. What was he trying to tell us? Why document these fragments of fear, these half-formed warnings, if not to leave a trail for someone to follow? The diary doesn't just describe what he saw. It screams with what he couldn't say. And as the pages turn, one question lingers, heavier than the silence of an empty highway at midnight. What happens when the road you've driven 1,000 times starts driving back? The pages of the diary tremble with the weight of what came next. Entries that read less like the log of a trucker and more like the confessions of a man unraveling at the seams of reality. By October of 1990, the long stretches of highway had become something else entirely, no longer just asphalt and white lines, but a living thing, pulsing with secrets he could no longer ignore. He writes of the others, not the fellow drivers he'd share coffee with at diners, but the ones who never stopped, the ones whose headlights flickered in his rear view like dying stars, only to vanish when he glanced back a second time. There was the black sedan, always the black sedan, matching his speed for miles without ever overtaking, its windows too dark to see inside. And then there were the trucks, identical to his own, but empty, parked at rest stops in the dead of night, engines cold, doors ajar, as if their drivers had simply stepped away. Yet no footprints disturbed the frost on the ground. No voices carried on the wind. The landscapes shifted too. Roads he'd driven 100 times before, now twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The exit signs pointing to towns that didn't exist on any map. In one entry, he describes a stretch of Interstate 80, where the trees leaned in too close, their branches knitting together overhead like skeletal fingers. The CB radio, usually alive with chatter, fell silent for hours. When it crackled back to life, the voices weren't his fellow truckers. They were his own, repeating phrases he'd spoken days before, but distorted, as if played backward through static. Then came the night he swore the road itself moved. A long, empty straightaway in Nevada, where the horizon seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living thing. His headlights caught glimpses of figures standing just beyond the shoulder, too still to be hitchhikers, too solid to be shadows. They never waved, they never spoke, they only watched, and when he looked again, they were gone. But the air in the cab grew thick, like the moment before a storm, and the scent of ozone clung to his clothes for days. What chills the blood most isn't the fear in his words, it's the creeping certainty that he was no longer running from something, but toward it. The diary's margins fill with frantic sketches, symbols scrawled in haste, coordinates that lead to nowhere, and a single phrase underlined so hard the pen tore the paper. They know I see them now, and perhaps that was the true horror all along. Not the disappearance, not the silence, but the awful suspicion that whatever lurked in the spaces between the miles had been waiting for him to notice. The pages of his diary trembled under the flickering glow of a roadside diner's neon sign, each word pressed into the paper as if etched by a hand no longer certain of its own strength. By October 1990, the unease that had gnawed at him for months had hardened into something darker, something that refused to be ignored. He wrote of a decision now, one that would drag him further into the abyss he'd only glimpsed in the shadows of his rearview mirror. I can't keep pretending this is just exhaustion, the entry began. The ink smudged where his fingers had lingered too long. They're watching, and if I don't face them, they'll take more than my sleep. They'll take the truth. The nights had grown longer, the highways stretching like veins of some living thing, pulsing with unseen intent. He described the way his headlights would catch fleeting shapes, figures too tall, too still, standing just beyond the tree line, vanishing when he blinked. The CB radio, once a lifeline of static-choked camaraderie, now hissed with voices that weren't his own, whispering coordinates that led nowhere. I followed one last night, he confessed, the words raw with something like shame. 3 hours off route, deep into back roads that shouldn't have existed. When I turned back, my odometer had rolled backward. 3 hours, gone. His writing jagged, as if the pen itself resisted the admission. But it was the dream, or the memory, he could no longer tell which, that broke him. A recurring vision of a black sedan, its headlights like hollow eyes, always parked at the next rest stop, always empty when he approached. It's not a dream, he scrawled. underlining the words twice. It's a warning, or an invitation. The diary's margins filled with sketches, a symbol scratched into the metal of his trailer, a sequence of numbers repeated on road signs, a face half glimpsed in the side mirror, pieces of a puzzle he was no longer sure he wanted to solve. Yet resolve had settled over him, like the weight of a loaded trailer. "Tomorrow I drive to Black Hollow," the final lines declared. The ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. The name alone sent a chill through the narrative. Black Hollow, a stretch of abandoned highway where trucks had vanished for decades, where the pavement itself seemed to swallow headlights whole. He knew the risks. He'd heard the stories, but the alternative, living with the knowledge that something was using the roads as its hunting ground, that it had marked him, was worse. "If I don't come back," he wrote, "burn the diary. But if you're reading this, you already know I didn't." The page ended there. No signature, no farewell, just the ghost of a man who had chosen to step into the dark rather than let the dark take him unawares. And as the diary's next entry would reveal, the dark was waiting. The diary's final pages were not written. They were clawed into existence. The ink bled through the paper like veins of dread, each word a jagged whisper from a mind unraveling at the seams. By October 12th, 1990, the entries had abandoned coherence entirely, replaced by a language of frantic symbols and half-formed warnings that seemed to pulse with something just beyond understanding. He no longer wrote to document his days. He wrote toward something off. The first ominous shift came in the margins. Between the log of mile markers and fuel stops, cramped scribbles began to appear. Phrases like "they move when the headlights dim," and "the CB radio hums when no one's there." Then came the sketches, crude, repeating shapes that resembled neither man nor machine, but something in between. One page was devoted entirely to a single trembling line. "It's not the road that's wrong. It's the space between the lanes." The words were underlined so violently the pen tore the paper. By October 14th, the entries dissolved into a fever dream of paranoia. He described the long-haul men who aren't men, figures glimpsed in the rearview mirror at 3 a.m., their faces stretched too wide by the glow of dashboard lights. One passage, written in what looked like motor oil, read, "They've been riding with me since Kansas. They don't need seats." The handwriting slanted downward, as if dragged by an unseen weight, the letters collapsing into one another, like exhausted breath. Then came the warnings, not for himself, but for someone else. "Tell her to check the odometer when I'm gone. The last load wasn't cargo. They'll say it was an accident, but the brakes were fine." The final entry before the blank pages was a single smudged sentence, the ink blurred as if written through tears or rain. "I think I remember now, and that's why I have to disappear." The diary didn't just document a man's descent. It recorded something else entirely, something that had been watching, waiting, in the static between radio channels and the flicker of highway lights. And as the pages turned toward that last, fateful night, one question clawed at the edges of every entry, unspoken but deafening. What had he finally remembered? And more terrifying still, what had remembered him? The pages tremble in his grip as the ink bleeds into the paper, each word a frantic whisper pressed between the lines of exhaustion and dread. The date at the top, June 12, 1990, is smudged, as if his fingers had hesitated, as if time itself had stuttered in that moment. He writes not for an audience, but for the void, for the silence that has begun to press in around him like a living thing. And there, in the flickering glow of the truck's dome light, he confesses what he can no longer speak aloud. "I saw him again." The words are raw, unfiltered by the rational mind that had once kept him company on these endless highways. He describes the figure, not a man, not quite, standing at the edge of the rest stop's gravel lot, where the pavement dissolved into the hungry dark of the Nevada desert, tall, too still, the way it had tilted its head, not like a person curious, but like something listening. The air had gone thick, the kind of silence that isn't empty but waiting. And then it had lifted a hand, not in greeting, not in warning, just acknowledgement, as if they'd been expecting him. His pen digs deeper, the letters slanting wildly across the page. It knows my name. He doesn't explain how. He doesn't need to. The terror is in the way the sentence fractures mid-thought, in the way the next line begins with a shaking, "I didn't," before trailing off into a scrawl of frantic crosses, as if he'd tried to scratch the words out entirely. The ink is wet with something more than tears. The truck's cab smells of sweat and metal, and something older, something like damp earth after a storm. Then, the final entry, a single broken sentence that chills the blood even now. Decades later, it's in the rest is a jagged tear across the page, as if the diary had been ripped from his hands mid-word. But the worst part is the smear of dirt at the bottom of the page. Fresh, deliberate, a fingerprint, not his. The truck's engine still hums in the background of his memory, a steady, indifferent pulse as the headlights cut through the dark. He had reached for the ignition. He had meant to drive. But the diary lies open on the seat beside him, the last entry staring up like an accusation. Somewhere beyond the glass, the figure waits, and this time, it isn't alone. The page ends. The story doesn't quote T. What would you have done if the night itself had started whispering back? The diary's yellowed pages lay open on the kitchen table, its ink faded, but the words still sharp enough to cut through decades of silence. The family had waited 23 years for answers, 23 years of birthdays, marked by absence, holidays haunted by an empty chair, and nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had suffered, if he had called for them in the dark. And now, here it was, not the peace they had prayed for, but something far heavier, the truth he had carried alone. His wife's hands trembled as she traced the final entry, her breath shallow, as if the air itself had turned to glass. The words were frantic, the handwriting slanting wildly across the page. They know what I saw. And then nothing, no explanation, no goodbye. Just the raw, unfiltered terror of a man who had realized, too late, that he was not just a truck driver on a lonely highway, but a witness to something far darker. Her tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink, as if even now she could wash away what he had written. But the words remained, stubborn as the grief that had taken root in her bones. Their daughter, now a woman with her own children, clutched the diary to her chest, as if it were the last piece of him she would ever hold. She had been 8 when he vanished, her memories of him reduced to the scent of diesel on his jacket and the way his laugh rumbled through the house. For years, she had imagined him lost, confused, maybe even starting a new life somewhere else. Anything but this. The diary's revelations didn't just shatter those fantasies. They replaced them with something worse, the knowledge that he had been afraid, that he had tried to warn them, and that no one had listened in time. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the occasional sob or the rustle of pages being turned with reverence, as if each one might hold a clue they had missed. There was a strange, awful relief in finally understanding why he had been distant in those last weeks, why he had started carrying that old revolver in the glove compartment, why he had whispered to his wife one night, "If anything happens to me, you burn the logs from October." They had thought it was the rambling of a tired man. Now, they knew it was a confession. But relief is a cruel companion to grief. It doesn't soften the edges of loss. It only makes the weight of it more precise. They had spent years blaming themselves. If only they had asked more questions. If only they had noticed the fear in his eyes. Now, they blamed the world. The police who had dismissed his disappearance as another runaway. The truck stop attendants who had shrugged when asked about the stranger in the black sedan. The system that had failed him then and was still failing him now. His case file gathering dust, in some forgotten archive. As the hours passed, the family sat in the dim light of the kitchen. The diary passed between them like a sacred cursed thing. They read his words aloud, as if speaking them could somehow set him free. And in the hollow spaces between the lines, they began to understand that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be carried. The diary didn't bring him back. It didn't even bring them closure, but it brought them something else. A shared burden, a reason to keep searching, to demand answers not just for themselves, but for the man who had tried, in his final moments, to leave them a trail of breadcrumbs through the dark. Now the question lingers, heavy and unspoken. What does a family do with a truth like this? Do they let it consume them, or do they let it fuel them? The diary's discovery has cracked open old wounds, but it has also lit a fire, one that might finally burn away the shadows that took him. And perhaps, in the embers, they'll find not just the man they lost, but the strength they never knew they had. The diary's yellowed pages, now spread across the investigator's desk, seemed to hum with secrets long buried. Each word, each hastily scribbled note, was a thread pulling at the frayed edges of a mystery that had gone cold decades ago. When the truck driver's journal resurfaced in the attic of an abandoned gas station, tucked behind a loose floorboard, as if waiting for the right moment to be found, it didn't just reopen a case, it ignited a spark in a darkness that had swallowed the truth for 33 years. And with that spark came a question no one had dared to ask in decades. What if they had been looking in all the wrong places? The authorities moved swiftly, but not without hesitation. Old case files were dusted off, their brittle pages whispering of dead ends and forgotten witnesses. Detectives, some now gray-haired and weary, found themselves staring at the same names they'd crossed out years ago. Only this time, the diary's final entries cast them in a new, sinister light. There was the diner waitress who'd served him his last coffee, her statement from 1990 dismissive, almost too rehearsed. He seemed fine, just tired. But the diary told a different story. She knows. I saw it in her eyes. Then there was the mechanic at the truck stop, the one who'd insisted the driver's rig was in perfect condition before he vanished. Yet the journal's margins held a frantic sketch, a loose bolt, a tampered brake line, and a single chilling phrase, "They want me silent." Witnesses were tracked down again, their memories prodded like bruises that never quite healed. Some recoiled, their voices trembling, as they realized how much they'd missed, or chosen to ignore. Others, though, leaned in, their curiosity piqued by the weight of what they might finally uncover. The waitress, now a grandmother, broke down when shown the diary's pages. "I thought he was just another tired man on the road," she confessed, her hands shaking. "But he kept asking about the new owner of the motel, the one who wasn't there before." The mechanic, his face ashen, admitted he'd been paid to look the other way that night. "I didn't know what they'd do to him," he muttered. "I didn't know." Meanwhile, the family clung to each revelation like a lifeline, their hope warring with a creeping dread. Every new lead was a flicker of light in the tunnel of their grief. But what if the light only illuminated something far worse than the unknown? The diary had given them answers, yes, but it had also handed them a map to a truth they might not survive. And as the investigation deepened, one thing became painfully clear. The driver hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased. Now, the question lingers, heavy in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? When the echoes of a voice long silenced finally demand to be heard? Perhaps the real mystery isn't where he went, but who was desperate enough to make sure he never came back. And as the pieces inch closer to forming a picture, one can't help but wonder, are you ready to see what's been hiding in the shadows all along? The whispers began in the dimly lit corners of the diner, where the truckers still gathered at dawn, their mugs of black coffee steaming against the cold morning air. It was there, between the hum of the jukebox and the clatter of silverware, that the story of James Holloway's diary first took root, not as a headline, but as something far more haunting, a secret kept for decades, now unearthed, like a relic from a forgotten grave. And as the pages of his final entries circulated through the tight-knit community, something shifted. The air grew heavier, thick, with the weight of unanswered questions and the ghostly echo of other names, other faces, that had vanished just as suddenly, just as mysteriously. The diary didn't just reopen a case, it cracked open a wound. In the quiet streets of Millfield, where the streetlights flickered like dying fireflies, neighbors who had long since moved on found themselves pausing mid-conversation, their voices trailing off as memories surfaced. There was Marcus Reeves, the gas station attendant who disappeared in '87. His car found abandoned near the old highway overpass, the driver's seat still warm. And then there was Linda Carter, the night shift nurse, whose last known words were scribbled on a napkin at the all-night truck stop. He said he saw something in the woods. The diary's revelations didn't just belong to James Holloway anymore. They belonged to every family that had ever stared at an empty chair at the dinner table, to every spouse who had ever traced the edges of a missing person's poster until the paper wore thin dot. The local library became an unofficial shrine. Copies of the diary's excerpts were taped to the community board beside faded photographs of the missing, their smiles frozen in time. Strangers lingered there, their fingers brushing the yellowed edges of newspaper clippings, as if searching for a thread that might finally unravel the truth. Some came with their own stories, half-remembered details, whispers passed down like cautionary tales. A trucker swore he'd seen a figure standing too still by the side of Route 12 on the night James vanished, its silhouette too tall, too wrong. A waitress confessed she'd once served a man who matched the description of the last person seen with Linda Carter, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as he paid in cash. The diary had done more than rekindle interest. It had awakened a collective dread, the kind that slithered into dreams and turned the familiar into something sinister. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else, something fragile and fiercely human. In the pews of St. Mary's Church, where the stained glass saints watched over the congregation with silent judgment, candles flickered for James, for Marcus, for Linda, and for all the others who had slipped through the cracks of time. The priest's voice cracked as he led the prayer, his words weaving together the names of the lost, like a litany of the forgotten. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and damp earth, the same earth that had held James Holloway's secrets for so long. The community had spent years learning to live with the unknown, but now the unknown had a voice. It spoke in the margins of a diary, in the trembling hands of those who read it, in the shared glance between strangers who suddenly understood they were not alone in their grief. So what does it mean when the past refuses to stay buried? When the whispers of the missing rise like smoke from the pages of a dead man's confessions? Perhaps it is a reminder that every name, every face, every unanswered question is a thread in the same tangled web of human experience. And maybe, just maybe, the truth isn't just something to be found. It's something to be felt in the catch of a breath, in the weight of a shared silence, in the quiet understanding that some stories don't end with answers, but with the echo of a question that refuses to fade. What will you remember when the next name is called? And what will you do when the past knocks on your door, holding out a diary of its own? The diary's last entry had ended with a single, cryptic line. They know where I've been. If this is found, don't trust the road. For 30 years those words lingered like a ghost in the margins of the investigation, a whisper from beyond the grave that no one could decipher. But now, buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned roadside diner, one the truck driver had frequented in his final weeks, a rusted metal lockbox has surfaced. Inside, a collection of items that don't just rewrite the case, they unravel it entirely. There were receipts, time-stamped, from gas stations, along a route he was never officially logged to have taken, detours into remote stretches of highway where cell towers didn't reach, and where, according to old dispatch logs, No deliveries were scheduled. A hand-drawn map, its ink faded but still legible, traced a path to a cluster of coordinates deep in the backwoods, circled in red, with a single word scrawled beside them, mine. And then, most chilling of all, a Polaroid. The image was blurred, as if taken in haste, but the figures were unmistakable. 3 men in dark coveralls, their faces obscured by the glare of a flashlight, standing beside a truck that matched the make and model of the one he drove, the date stamp on the photo, 2 days after he was last seen alive. The implications are a labyrinth of possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Was he smuggling something or someone? Had he stumbled onto an operation far bigger than himself, one that silenced him before he could speak? The coordinates lead to an old mining site, long abandoned, or so the records claim, but satellite imagery from the last decade shows fresh tire tracks, sporadic but deliberate, as if the land is still in use by those who don't want to be found. And then there's the lockbox itself. Why hide it in a diner he frequented? Was it a fail-safe, a way to ensure the truth would eventually surface? Or was it a message left for someone specific, someone who never came to claim it? The police have reopened the case, but the questions now outnumber the answers. The family, who had long since resigned themselves to never knowing, now face a cruel new uncertainty. Was his disappearance an accident of fate, or the calculated work of hands still moving in the shadows? And if it's the latter, how deep does the conspiracy go? As the lockbox sits under forensic lights, its secrets spilling into the cold fluorescence of the evidence room, one can't help but wonder, was this the missing piece that finally lays the mystery to rest? Or is it the first domino in a chain reaction of revelations, ones that will pull back the curtain on something far darker than a single man's vanished life? Close your eyes and imagine it, a lonely stretch of highway at night, the hum of an engine, the flicker of headlights in the rearview mirror. He knew something. He tried to tell us, and now, decades later, the road is speaking back. The question is, are we ready to listen? The diary's final page closed with a question, not an answer. And so, 3 decades after his disappearance, the truck driver's story lingers, not as a case file gathering dust, but as a wound that never quite healed. The ink on those yellowed pages didn't just reveal a secret, it carved a new kind of emptiness into the lives of those who loved him. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to haunt. His family had spent years chasing ghosts, clinging to the hope that one day the truth would walk through their door like he once did. But the diary didn't bring him back. It only gave them fragments, a whispered confession, a half-erased route, the name of a town he never should have stopped in. The investigators called it a breakthrough. To them, it was another thread to pull in a case that had long gone cold. But to his daughter, now gray-haired and gripping the diary's edges like a lifeline, it was something far worse, proof that the man she knew had been carrying a burden so heavy he chose to vanish, rather than let it crush them all. What does it mean to find answers that only deepen the silence? The diary's final entry didn't point to a grave or a killer. It pointed to a choice, a moment on a rain-slicked highway, a decision made in the dead of night, a secret so dangerous it could only be trusted to the pages of a book no one was ever meant to read. The police reopened the case, of course. They traced the names, dug up old records, followed the breadcrumbs he'd left behind, like a man marking his own trail into the dark. But some trails don't lead anywhere. Some just circle back to the same unanswerable question: why? And so, the legacy of that diary isn't just in the clues it held, it's in the way it changed the family forever. His wife, who had spent years convinced he'd simply walked away, now lies awake, wondering if he'd been running towards something far worse. His son, who inherited his father's love for the open road, stares at the dashboard of his own truck and wonders if the same restlessness that drove his father to disappear hums in his own blood. The diary didn't give them closure. It gave them a mirror, and in its cracked glass, they saw not just his face, but their own grief, reflected back at them in endless, fractured pieces. Perhaps the most chilling truth of all is this: some stories aren't meant to end, they're meant to echo. And as you sit here now, listening to this tale of a man who vanished into the night, carrying a secret he took to whatever grave waits for the lost, ask yourself, what would you do if the only way to protect the ones you love was to become a ghost? The road stretches on, the diary's pages have gone silent, but the question remains, whispered on the wind, like the hum of an engine fading into the dark. What else is still out there waiting to be found?